So now we've covered some of the basics of the endocrine system, like what is a hormone, what is exocrine versus an endocrine gland, the different types of hormones, how hormones are released. But we need to move on and start to talk about these major endocrine glands, what specific hormones they create and release, and what the function of those hormones is in the body. And this whole section will be devoted just to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland because these are the most robust, most complicated glands out there. In fact, the pituitary gland used to be called the master gland of the endocrine system. And then it turned out the hypothalamus was in charge of the pituitary gland. So now it's kind of the master gland. So let's take a look. Hypothalamus is part of the brain and it coordinates and integrates the nervous and endocrine systems, meaning like as part of the brain, but also as an endocrine structure, it can be kind of a go-between between these two major organ systems. Nervous system kind of operating very quickly, but endocrine operating more as a slower response mechanism. The hypothalamus uses three mechanisms. There's three ways that it works with the endocrine system. One is that it makes its own hormones that do stuff. We'll figure out what later. It's these two hormones, ADH and oxytocin, but it makes those hormones. We know it must make hormones because we're calling it an endocrine gland, and all endocrine glands make hormones. So that's just the basic thing it has to do. But it does other stuff too. It makes other hormones, regulatory hormones. So it makes these hormones that control the anterior pituitary. As we'll discover, the pituitary gland is really in two parts. And as I get my pen out here, if we look at this pituitary gland picture, we can see perhaps there's a difference in the front of the pituitary here. They've kind of made orange, and in the back here it's yellow. That's because there's a anterior and posterior pituitary. So the regulatory hormones made by the hypothalamus control the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. A third thing that the hypothalamus can do to be the go-between between the nervous system and endocrine system is it sends neurons all the way down to the adrenal gland to directly control what it secretes, specifically from its medulla. So already, hopefully, you're starting to, or you can, as I talk you through it, look back at the first chunk of the endocrine system where we talked about how are hormones released. We said maybe you've got some regulatory hormones that are involved, or maybe there's direct neural control. So the hypothalamus actually covers, just on its own, two types of hormone release. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at what the hypothalamus is up to. So we can see here, so the hypothalamus is labeled. It has kind of this like duck or bird beak shape. And again, up top, we've got 1, 2, 3, meaning these are the three mechanisms the hypothalamus uses to integrate the nervous and endocrine system. We've kind of already talked through this. We said the endocrine system, I say it's kind of rude. It's rude because it makes its own hormones that do stuff, whatever, but it actually sends them to the posterior pituitary for storage and later release. So it's like bossing around. Well, it's being rude to the posterior pituitary by making it hold on to its hormones. In the anterior pituitary, we said it controls it with regulatory hormones. So it's bossy to the anterior pituitary. It's controlling the front, it's making the back hold stuff, and it pushes around the adrenal glands because there's these long neurons that go all the way down to the adrenal medulla, the inside part of the adrenal gland, and it controls hormone release down there. So, hypothalamus doing a lot. What about the pituitary gland? One thing you'll want to know is that the pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis. So that term will come up especially in Bio 6. But it is a term that's synonymous with the pituitary gland. It's protected sitting inside the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, our old friend. And as we mentioned, there's two lobes with very distinct functions, this anterior lobe and this posterior lobe. And there's lots of hormones associated with the pituitary gland. So we're just going to run through them. Oh, what? What is it? What? Oh, a flag top. Hey, what are you doing here, flag top? Well, let's see. I'm just here to teach you about the endocrine system. That's too much playing with my 3-year-old. Okay. Oh, flag top. These are going to give you the first letters of the hormones we're about to talk about. In fact, this is all of the hormones for this section, this whole hypothalamus and pituitary section. O of flag top. Because when we look at the pituitary gland and we look at the posterior lobe, this is actually made out of brain tissue. It's made out of nervous tissue, but it is an endocrine gland, of course. And hypothalamic hormones are stored here. So they're made by the hypothalamus, but they're stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary, which means they're secreted from the posterior lobe of the pituitary, but they're made in the hypothalamus. Important distinction. Made in one place, stored and secreted from another. So, OA, those are going to be the two we talk about. O is for oxytocin, sometimes called the cuddle hormone or cuddle drug, a pair bonding drug. So we have that in romantic attractions, familial and friendship. It can become activated. But it does very specific things to our anatomy also, like during male ejaculation, oxytocin aids in those muscle contractions. During birth, it aids in those muscle contractions of the uterus. When nursing, it aids in those muscle contractions that move the milk to the infant. So oxytocin definitely has this like emotional type of social connection thing going on in the brain, but also it will go out and find receptors on target cells in a lot of muscle that's affiliated with sex and reproduction. OA flag top. So the A is antidiuretic hormone, which for short you can call it ADH. We used to call it vasopressin, which gives you an idea that it had something to do with blood pressure, blood vessel pressure. Because it does, it can raise blood pressure. The other thing it does, though, is affects water reabsorption in the kidneys. We're going to talk about this a lot when we do the urinary system, but ADH has this term diuretic in the name, and maybe you've heard that like coffee and alcohol are diuretics. It means they make you pee a lot. Drinking coffee make you pee a lot? The answer is yes, it's a diuretic. It kind of throws your water conservation out of whack. Antidiuretic is more like your normal situation. Normally, your body wants to conserve water. And remember, these hormones are basically chemical messengers. They're going around through the body, delivering some message. So ADH's message is conserve water, conserve water, conserve water. So usually your body's conserving water. We're like 60 or 70% water, right? We don't want to waste it. You need it. So coffee and alcohol are diuretics, meaning they cause you to lose water from the kidneys, making watery urine. We'll talk more about that later. So ADH, its messages conserve water, and it can affect blood pressure. So now we're on to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So this is flag top, FLAGTOP. That's 7 hormones. So we're going to talk about 7 hormones. These are all secreted from the anterior pituitary. This chunk of the pituitary gland is actually made from glandular tissue, meaning it's not brain tissue like the posterior lobe. It's controlled still by the hypothalamus from these regulatory hormones. And when it's told to by the hypothalamus, it will release those hormones into the blood. We got 7 to look at. Number 1, we're doing flag top, right? So it should be F. F is for follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. A follicle is a little group of cells that protects the eggs of the females in the ovary. So if you stimulate the follicle, really what you're doing is like you're getting those eggs to continue their development. So it stimulates the follicles to develop the eggs. It does basically the same thing in males. There's no follicles down there in males in the testes, but it does stimulate spermatogenesis, the creation of new sperm. So in either case, FSH has a similar job, doing it a little bit differently, but the goal is to like get the gametes, the sperm and egg, ready to go. Flag top. So next is L, luteinizing hormone, or LH. In females, LH stimulates ovulation. So this is a big thing in probably lots of animal medicine and health, but in the zoo industry where I used to work, we would monitor the LH levels of like captive animals or endangered species that we were trying to breed. Because mammals will have this spike in LH, it has a name, it's called the LH surge. When the LH spikes, that triggers ovulation. So if you're monitoring the urine of an Asian elephant that you want to get pregnant, when that spikes, you know it's time to introduce a male, or maybe a syringe full of bull elephant semen, if that's the plan. Either way, LH surge will tell you ovulation is occurring. So if you've ever picked up or seen an ovulation test, it's just a pee stick that will look for LH in human urine to tell if a female has ovulated. And you can use that information and apps, they have apps for this to track your LH levels to try to help you get pregnant. Maybe not surprisingly, luteinizing hormone also helps prepare the uterus for pregnancy, because if you've ovulated, then maybe pregnancy is coming, so it can help prepare. In males, it stimulates the production of testosterone. So still has a reproductive effect, but obviously a little bit different in males. Flag top. Next is A, adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is a great name because when you break it down, you're like, all right, I got it. Like renal is kidney, and the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys. So we're doing something with the adrenal glands here. Cortico refers to the cortex of the adrenal glands. That's the outside. The medulla is on the inside, just like the medullary cavity is the inside of bone. The cortex is the outside, just like compact bone is sometimes called cortical bone because it's on the outside. Tropic is like a level kind of thing. So this is basically means that this hormone is going to kick off the next level of hormones that get secreted from the cortex of the adrenal gland. Is that okay? It's a little much, but adrenocorticotropic hormone kind of tells you what its deal is. Stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce some other hormone. In this case, we're making stress hormones, glucocorticoids. So glucose is kind of like glucose. One of the things these do is release a bunch of sugar. If you're stressed, you need some energy to deal with this stressor, sugars get released, glucose. So glucocorticoids. This is a very complicated pathway that I had to learn in my PhD program and memorize, and we won't do it here, but it is a classic endocrine pathway, this ACTH. Flag top. Next is G, growth hormone. Pretty straightforward. Stimulates cell growth and replication by speeding up protein synthesis. If it works, then it'll work. If it doesn't work, there are a variety of disorders that can occur depending on when you've received too little growth hormone or too much growth hormone. Meaning like if you get too much growth hormone early in your development, then all of your limbs will be longer and your torso and everything will have grown more than is typical. If you're an adult and you get like a tumor on your pituitary and a bunch of growth hormone starts getting secreted, then most of your body won't respond, but your leg bones and feet bones will actually respond. And so they'll start to grow. So you get this lengthening in certain parts of your body. And then there's growth hormone deficiency. still often being called pituitary dwarfism, although for obvious reasons, the better name to use is growth hormone deficiency, in which case too little growth hormone early in development can lead to small stature. So growth hormone, one of these classic endocrine hormones that remind us that much of the endocrine system's functioning is long-term. Like you want to have the right amount of growth hormone your whole life, because at any time, especially too much, can start to cause problems. Flag top. So next is T, thyroid stimulating hormone. Its job, as its name implies, is to stimulate the thyroid gland. And it stimulates it to produce its own hormones called T3 and T4. We're going to talk about T3 and T4 later. Right now, we're just acknowledging that TSH stimulates the thyroid to make these other hormones. So we'll come back to T3 and T4 and figure out what they do later. Flag top. The O is like not the best. It's buried inside the word melanocyte. So flag top includes melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, as its name implies, stimulates melanocytes to make and release melanin. So if you remember back studying the integumentary system, melanocytes' job is to make these vesicles full of melanin and transfer them into keratinocytes for UV protection. And last is P from OA flag top. P is for prolactin. The key part of this word is lac, like lactic, lactate, lactation. And pro is like before. So before you lactate, right? Like here's mom, and she's like sad. Oh no, it's not working. I can't feed the baby. Prolactin. What do you have to do before you feed the baby? You have to make milk. So oxytocin, we talked about earlier, is like letting the milk down. Remember, oxytocin contracts muscles, male ejaculation muscles, uterine contraction muscles during birth, and it contracts muscles that aid in letting the milk down. Before you lactate, though, you have to make milk. So she'll be happy when she starts to make milk. This baby looks like it's got plenty of milk. Stimulates milk production. What about in males? Has something to do with sexual functioning. It's not very well understood, but there's definitely been some research, as described in this article I found, that just says basically like males will have poorer sexual functioning, meaning like, well, I don't know, you can just look it up. It just relates to sexual functioning. So to finish off, here is one slide that kind of captures all of that information. You've got both of your hypothalamic hormones, OA, oxytocin and ADH, that are produced by the hypothalamus, but stored in the posterior pituitary. Then you've got flag top, the 7 other hormones we just went through that are secreted by, synthesized here and secreted by the anterior pituitary. Oh, flag top.